the door people enter in, their felt need of how they enter in. For some people, they have a felt need of forgiveness for sin. So for them, the gospel of Jesus dying on the cross for your sins is good news, and they will enter in the door. For others, they have an awareness of sin. So what are we going to do? Try to convince them that they're sinners? Hey, you stole paper clips in the office. Like, didn't you lie? Didn't you look on the computer? Something you shouldn't have. Oh, night. You're trying to create a need they don't have. Yeah. Others, it's like their need is for purpose. They feel empty. They feel, what's the point of all this? Well, they're like, Jesus' kingdom is a beautiful aspect of the gospel. It's a whole new purpose, a whole new way to live. For others, it's love, like the lack of relationships. And so they're the gospel of adoption. You are a son and daughter brought into a physical family, that you have new life, new relationships. And then for others, it's the brokenness of being burnt out on religion. It's like, hey, no, the good news is Jesus has replaced the temple, the sacrifices, the priests, everything. You don't need any of this.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. On this podcast, we share stories from church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, a pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or just curious to learn more, our hope is that these conversations inspire you to be a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. If this podcast blesses you, we'd love for you to share episodes and subscribe on your preferred platform. Now, let's dive into our next conversation. Well, welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for joining us for this episode and this conversation. If you're new to the podcast, a very special welcome to you. I'm glad that you are with us, and my hope is that this podcast and these episodes inspire and equip you to become a sower of the gospel in the places you live, work, learn, and play. Well, I hope you had a very enjoyable holiday season and a very special Happy New Year to you. It's now 2025. It's hard to believe. And this is now episode 60. And so if you've been with us from the very beginning, that's amazing. I'm glad you're continuing with us. And if this is new for you, maybe a New Year's resolution is to jump on board with this podcast and listen and come back most weeks. Well, hey, I'm excited for you today to hear a conversation that I had with Vijay Krishnan. Vijay is the pastor at The Well, and he spent the first 11 years of his working life doing brand marketing for large Canadian and multinational businesses. In 2009, he was privileged to become the lead pastor of the church which he and his wife Jennifer had helped start a few years earlier. The Well is one church with 3 congregations in the North GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, working to see the unchurched, dechurched, and post-everything people of the GTA come to know and love Jesus. Vijay, Jennifer, and their 3 boys love being part of what God is doing through the local church. And in his spare time, Vijay enjoys listening to loud music, cooking, playing sports with his family, and snowboarding. In this conversation, Vijay explores the various ways individuals connect with the gospel based on their personal needs and experiences. He emphasizes that the gospel is universal, but acknowledges that people enter through different doors depending on their felt needs, such as forgiveness, purpose, love, and relief from religious burnout. Well, friends, without further ado, here is my conversation with Vijay. Well, Vijay Krishnan, a very special welcome to you and welcome to the Sowers Podcast.
Thanks, Matt. So good to be with you.
Vijay, something that I start with often with my guests is to hear a little bit about how the gospel was sown into their life and how they came to trust and to surrender to Jesus Christ. I'd love for you to begin there if you don't mind.
Yeah. So I grew up in a home where my parents are East Indian. My dad had grown up in a Hindu Brahmin home in North India, and my mom kind of close to him, but nominal Christian faith. So my dad became a believer in India at the age of 17, and just kind of a radical life change for him. And then immigrated to the U.S. and studied as an engineer and worked as an engineer, and then a nuclear engineer, and then became the pastor of our church when I was 4. So I say that just to say that so shaped my upbringing. So I was, grew up in a home that was influenced by the East. They're Indian family. My father coming from Eastern religion, but then being a a left brain engineer, and then the pastor of our church. So I had, I would say, like the introduction of the journey to faith was shaped by a really positive experience with the church. As family, as home. We lived across the street from the church. Like we were in the parsonage. So like I had the biggest backyard ever because we didn't even have a fence back then. So, I grew up playing ball hockey back there and grew up, my parents were great with just sort of letting us be ourselves as we grew up in the church, but it was such a positive environment for me. It's obviously where I met Christ, but very much connected with Christ's community and his body, and then shaped by my parents, and especially my dad sat under his teaching for 25 years or whatever, and so this kind of comes from a both and kind of context of Hinduism and an either or context of left brain engineering, and was a teacher. Like I just learned so much. So for me, there was no like false dichotomy between science and faith because my father was a scientist. He was a person of faith. There was no false dichotomy between sort of intellectualism and emotion in terms of like how those things meet in faith. So yeah, it was really my experience with the church, my experience with my parents, my encounter with Christ through his spirit in all of that. Yeah, I don't have a moment. I remember moments, when I know the spirit was kind of breaking in and touching my heart. And so I feel like I was so blessed with the environment that helped, open to the spirit that produced faith that transformed every part of my life, really. So that's the semi-short version.
And how did you transition into local pastoring? I know that you maybe didn't take some of the routes that maybe some of our listeners would think, you graduate from high school, you go to, theological school or seminary. Tell us a little bit about your own story, and that'll then shape a little bit of what we get into in a little bit here.
Yeah, I actually wanted to go to Bible college coming out of high school. My dad said to me, why don't you go study, like get a degree at a university that's not theologically based, which is funny advice from a pastor, but I think he had come through the back door as well, right? Right. Kind of studied science and engineering, whatever. So ended up, taking a business degree, loved it. So then I worked for 11 years in packaged goods marketing, retail marketing, advertising, that kind of thing. But along the way in 2005, my wife and I were with a group of people from my dad's church that left to go plant in the city of Vaughan, plant a church. And I was leading the worship ministry there just as a volunteer. And our youth pastor became the planting pastor. And so we went with a group of probably about 50, people in their mid to late 20s was the core. And I was a volunteer on the lead team. And, it was like, that just started many what if conversations with my wife, because I realized man, I love this. I liked my job. I was getting paid a lot of money, really enjoyed what I was doing, but I would come into work on Monday exhausted because I had left it all on the floor,
Wow.
during the week in this church plant. And a church planting environment, as you know, Matt, it's a vacuum. It sucks you in. What's his name? The Godfather. Every time you try to sort of get out, it pulls you back in. It was this, I couldn't get enough. And I was not just interested in the worship ministry. I was interested in all of it. I was so troubled in the positive sense with how do we create and build this community of faith for the people I was working with, who I was convinced had walked away from a Jesus they had never met.
Wow.
Because of the church, because of their church experience. And me and my peers who had planted this thing were we're all seeing this. We're hearing this over and over. People are not uninterested in spirituality or God or Jesus, but they want nothing to do with the church. So how do we plant a place for people like that? Was the question that was keeping me up at night. And, so then 3 years in, the planting pastor, he's an entrepreneur. He was great at pulling a team together, but he felt like he had taken it as far as he can go. And he said, hey, I think it's time for me to move on. What about you? And I was like, oh man, I don't know. I was enjoying what I was doing. I mean, my wife was was there before I was. She was like, you should do this,
Wow.
Which is great because you don't have to convince your spouse to make that kind of a change. So I kind of had one of those weekends where I just went away with a friend of mine who was just a good question asker. And I put out on the table in prayer with God all of my fears and objections to making this decision. Financial, the hit was going to take. We had 2 kids and a mortgage. How's this going to work? My wife had decided to put her teaching career on hold to stay home with our boys. So it was like, how's this going to work? Failure. I was like legitimately, considering the fact that this thing could fail completely on my watch. It was still in a very fledgling stage too. We were 3.5 years in and I didn't know what I was doing. Like I'd preached once in my life, never led a church, and yeah, just the weight. And then like kind of just stepping off the one career path that I had been on for a while, you realize like, okay, like I am walking away from this. So fear, greed, uncertainty, all the things, right? And I just put it on. I said, okay, God, I don't want these things to influence my decision. Like I'm probably not going to get rid of these things from my heart and mind completely. I just don't want them to have undue influence over the decision. And really actually came to the point where I was like, if I can't accept failure as a possibility, I can't do this. Like I have to accept that could happen, right? Like, okay. And what was interesting was, about a year before, things were, again, it was a new church. It was fledgling. People who you think are going to be with you for the long haul leave. Like that just happens, right?
Yeah.
And it felt like my wife and I had like 3 dinners in a row with people who were saying, we're leaving. And I remember coming home one Sunday and I'm sitting on the stairs and I was just like, this is frustrating. And I felt like the Spirit saying like, are you going to be the next one out or the last one out? And that was a really important question because I was like, okay, I'll be the last one out. Like if this thing does really fail, I'll shut the door on the way out if that's what it is. And that was long before I thought I was going to be on staff. So in one sense, I felt like the Spirit led me to make this really deep-hearted commitment that we made together, my wife and I, to it. And then within a year, so I think that prepared me to be able to say yes. So yeah, that's how it happened. But there's no way I would have been doing this if I had stayed at the relatively large church that we were at and didn't go on the plant. Because the first sermon I ever had to preach for when I was a volunteer was like a Saturday. The lead pastor called me. He's like, I tore my sternum lifting something. He's like, I can't move. What should we do tomorrow? And I'm on the phone going, we'll get an Andy Stanley video. And my wife's in the background going, you preach. And I'm like, there's no way, right? I've never preached in my life. It's Saturday, Matt. So like, I literally, thankfully we didn't record them back then. I write probably the worst sermon known to man. That was the first time. But if that happens when I'm at Rexdale, where you've got 10 staff, 12 elders, no one's calling me to preach. That's never happening if the lead pastor goes down. So I feel like there's no way I would have even been doing this if I hadn't gone as part of this plant. It just sucks you in and you end up doing things you never thought you would. And you have no business doing, but like you're the tallest short person, right? Everyone looks around and goes, well, I guess this is me. I always say to people, listen, if you're in over your head, welcome to the club. Like that's just kind of what this is about.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's so many places we could jump off there. I wondered if you'd speak first to the transition from being, a core team member to the identified, pastor of this community. Mm-hmm. What were some of the challenges with that? And then what were some of the strengths to that transition?
Let me start with the advantages. I would say, like for me personally, was I already knew the culture and the people. We already had friends. We were home. This was where we had decided to be. So there wasn't, I know people come into pastor churches that they haven't been a part of. I always find that, I guess that's the norm. I'm like, I don't know how you could do that because I felt like, we had our friends. So there wasn't like I'm the pastor, it's one of the people. Yeah. And so that felt really great. And I think for the most part, I've always felt like that. Like that's never changed. I'm sure people who come to our church since then, they see you differently, but so that was one advantage. 2 was like, it was such an integrating step for me of leaving a career where my family wasn't really involved in what I was doing. in marketing, my wife would come to a couple of work parties a year, right? And try to keep track of the names of the people I talked about. But this was like, man, my work is so connected in with my family. My kids are there on Sundays. Like, this is awesome. So that I loved. Thirdly, I think we had already been part of shaping the culture of the church. Like, this was our ethos, our values, the mission, the archetype of who we were trying to reach. I had already been able to play a huge role in shaping that along with the team. I was part of the team. So all of those things that, you sometimes come in and you're like, oh, am I aligned here with the values, the mission? Like, it was like lockstep. I was like, hey, if I don't like this I'm partly to blame. Like, we're, so all of that was like plus side. The challenges were, like, I'd say, like, I'd never led a board before. We didn't even have a board. So we formed the board. Most of the board members were new to being board members, and I'm new to being a lead pastor. So, there was not a lot of experience there on either side, and we're trying to figure it out. So I think, there's some things in retrospect you look back and you go, we could have done that differently, or we probably, I was chairing the board at first for a while because there wasn't anyone who wanted to be the chair, which was, a really bad idea. So, thankfully, by the grace of God, none of that went awry. We had generally like stable, emotionally healthy people. So God protected us through that, but like, obviously that's not ideal. So, I felt like I was 1 week ahead of my congregation, like going hand to mouth in terms of sermon writing and my own ecclesiology. Like, these are things like you never really think about when you grow up in the church, just the air you breathe, and suddenly you have to lead one and you're teaching. Right. You're like, well, what? You lay every brick. You do not, just because you're a plant from like a healthy, stable church, you don't start where they are and then just add to it or take away things you don't like and you want to change. And then you add, that's what you think it's going to be. It's not. You lay every brick. So I think the challenge of just like, man, how do we do this with, we're all new to this. And I'm supposed to lead them in their thinking, in their ecclesiology. And I'm like 1 week ahead of the church. Mm-hmm. So, that it felt like that for a while. Which now you look back on and think, oh, it's kind of exhilarating, kind of fun. But like at the time, like, oh my gosh. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was wondering then, transitioning to somewhat different, but I think still in the same vein, is how did your background in marketing, advertising, how did it also prepare you not for just leadership, but also in knowing how to reach people that, as you had said, they'd walked away from a Jesus they'd never really met?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it helped on a few levels. One was just trying to identify the person we're trying to reach. Like you do this all the time in marketing. Like, who is your core customer, right? Who's your core customer? What would you say to them if you had 1 minute across the table from them about the product you were selling? And these are all like kind of, mechanistic, utilitarian kind of things you learn when you're just trying to make profit, right? But then when you switch and going, this is people's lives. This is their future. This is their present. This is their past. This is everything. So it was helping. There was a few of us actually who were working this the time, just sort of going, okay, well, who, and so we kind of developed this archetype of like, it's a 30-year-old guy, probably from an Italian Catholic background, because that's just the city we're in. Kind of left church like a bat out of hell when he was 16 because his parents, stopped making him go or couldn't make him go anymore. Right. He gets married. He's got his first kid, and his mother-in-law's calling him saying, hey, you're going to baptize the kid. And he's like, oh no. Right. Mm-hmm. Like I believe in God. I am not going to put my kid through or my family through what I left. So now I'm in spiritual no man's land. So what do I do? So that was our archetype. We're like, that's who we talk to all the time. And that's who lives around us. And okay, so I think inherently starting with, this is Leslie Newbegin stuff, right? So much of this years and years and years ago, but even just, like start with where they are. Where are they at? I think like marketing, obviously it's just like, hey, like you can have strategies that just say, this is our great product. Look how amazing it is. Who wants to buy it? And let's talk all about the features of the product. Versus saying, who actually are we trying to reach? And what is the most genuine thing that we can say to them about what? And do we believe in it? Are we smoking what we're selling? Really? Like that's, and I think when it comes to the church and a new life in Christ, it's like, okay, so those are the two things. It's like, where are they at when it comes to Jesus? Like what is their mindset? What do they think? And that really helped us saying, okay, how do they think when they come into the building? What is that? We weren't in a building. We were in a movie theater. So that was great. What are their preconceived notions? How do we just right off the top address some of those things to help them feel, comfortable? What things are we going to talk about? So for example, like whenever we do communion, always just say, or whoever's serving it, saying, hey, in your tradition, you might have heard this is the Eucharist or the host or whatever. We're just like, hey, and then everyone goes, oh yeah, I know that, just kind of right away. We didn't take up offering because we're like, so many of my friends and so many of the people that were coming to that and so many of the people in our archetypes were like, oh, the church is just about money. And whether or not it is, that's just what they think it is. So if they think it is, that's reality, right? Like, you can try. And we're like, man, if we have to explain this piece of liturgy every Sunday, like there's a 5-minute caveat to something before we have to do it because we know we're having to address can we just not do it? Can we do it differently? Right? Can we talk about it appropriately? Like we would talk about any other spiritual practice that we talk about, right? Like on the regular, like just like we do anything, prayer, Sabbath, fasting, scripture, whatever. Okay. Giving. Yes. Like how do we kind of normalize that? And so I think that was the biggest thing is just like be centered on who you're trying to reach and think how they think first. And then the other one was, hey, we're not every church. They used to say in marketing, if you're not alienating somebody, you're not targeted enough. Wow. And of course you go into church ministry, you're like, well, I don't want to alienate anyone. And of course you don't. But the idea is saying, hey, you're not going to be every church. You can't. So what is your unique sense of, yes, we all have the same mission, right? To make disciples, people who will know and love and follow Jesus, right? But how we do that, each church has its little slice of calling based on where it is in the world, where it is in the redemptive history. What's the unique community of people that you're in? What's the unique makeup of the people that make up this church? Okay, so what are you going to be? And we razor sharp on that because you want people who buy into that. And so I always say, if there aren't people leaving our church from time to time, we're probably not focused enough. Now, if they're leaving every week, that's a problem, right? But like there are people who are like, well, we'd like to do this, we'd like to do this. And we just say, hey, you know what? Like here's why we don't do that. Here's why we do this. And then if they keep on, I'm like, hey, listen, maybe it's okay if we're not every person's church. Like, how do we help you find a place that fits with you or whatever? So I think just being like targeted and saying, this is who we are, like, this is the culture, this is how we feel uniquely the gospel is meant to be articulated and presented. And this is what we're doing. And we're okay to fit in the broader, community, the broader ecumenical movement of the church around the world. And so those two things I think were helpful.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Vijay in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about LifeWorthy. LifeWorthy provides and promotes supportive community and spiritual care for women exiting human trafficking relationship and or the sex industry and provides support for their family members. Based in the Greater Toronto Area, LifeWorthy operates as a project of SIM Canada. LifeWorthy offers 3 programs. One of their programs is called Daughters Help, which is for daughters, which provides advocacy, mentoring, peer support, and group events for young women exiting the sex industry and rebuilding their lives. Their second program is Parents Hope, which is for parents, and they host support groups and provide individual care for families or other family members impacted by the exploitation of a loved one. And then their third program is Advocacy and Training, which is for everyone. They are a leader in training and consulting on human trafficking and related issues, and they are a member agency of Canada's Demand Action Coalition and are always glad to respond to training and awareness needs. If you'd like to learn more about LifeWorthy, you can visit lifeworthy.ca. Once again, that is lifeworthy.ca. What do you think are some of the barriers that prevents leaders, boards, key people in a church from really identifying that archetype or really being crystal clear on the people that they're called to reach? Like I see kind of something going on in the church right now where I think that there's a lot of desire from fairly monoethnic churches. We want to become more multi-ethnic. We want to be a church that has every ethnicity represented. But in some sense, and I'd love you to speak to this, on your background is, and your geography is there a sense that is there a broadness around ethnicity that could deter you from being more specific about the unique group of people God's called you to reach? Or does that vary from city to city, region to region? And what would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I think we used to talk about this in marketing. It's like psychographic marketing versus demographic, psychographic segmentation versus demographic segmentation. So rather than just say, oh, well, we're trying to reach and I said the archetype in terms of a 30-year-old male, whatever, but like for us is really the psychographics. What's mentally behind their barriers to Christ and the church, right? And so then that means that there may not be only one demographic that shares that mentality, but there's a number of people who think that's where they're at. Right. So they believe in God. They're spiritually open. They kind of want faith for their kids, but they do not want to embrace where they've been. And they don't want the trappings or what feels like the institutional church. Okay, that's a psychographic kind of way of thinking about your target and segment. So to me, you start there. Rather than, we're trying to reach, young families or whatever. So that's one. Two, to me, the church, I think first and foremost has to be a reflection of the community it's in. I think if you're a very multi-ethnic church in a mono-ethnic community, yeah, okay, that you may have some advantages there, but how you talk to your community, or let's say vice versa, right? You're in a multi-ethnic community or a mono-ethnic church. Okay, well then I think there is a sense of urgency to say, how do we become more reflective of the community we're trying to reach? Interestingly, in our situation, we have 3 sites. Our Vaughan site is in the city of Vaughan, which is very multi-ethnic. And we have about 45 nationalities in our Vaughan congregation. But if you go kind of northwest, northeast, where our other 2 are in more kind of former farming townships, they're more, tend to be more white. And so our congregations in those sites are reflective of the communities that are around. So that to me is the first thing, is because if you're not reflective of the community around, then that's a problem. As opposed to say, well, in order to be effective, we need to be multi-ethnic, and we have to, if the church is multi-ethnic, that we have to be all. It's no, who are you trying to reach? And what is the makeup of the community, right? Even from let's say a socioeconomic standpoint, right? If you're in an economically depressed or challenged city, and you're high, an upper middle class in the church, okay, that's a challenge. It doesn't mean you have no business being there. It just means, okay, well, how are we going to think about then who we are and who we're trying to reach? So I think and one of the challenges you asked earlier is well, what's the challenge with boards and churches have? I think fundamentally we are insider focused, and our thinking is shaped as insiders. And the longer we've been a part of the church, the harder it is to think like someone who wants nothing to do with God. I look even at some of the emphasis right now on apologetics that we're sort of saying, okay, well, we need to equip our young people with apologetics. It's no, what we need to equip them with is, how do you talk to someone who uses psychedelics regularly and has experienced some modicum of inner healing through their psychedelic therapy group that they're a part of? Okay. They are not asking whether the Bible is an accurate document. These are people, right? It has to be focused on who we're trying to reach and where they're at, because the gospel is for all people and for all times. But the door that people enter in, their felt need of how they enter in, they say it for some people, they have a felt need of forgiveness for sin. So for them, the gospel of Jesus dying on the cross for your sins is good news, and they will enter in that door. For others, they have an awareness of sin. So what are we going to do? Try to convince them that they're sinners? Or you can't. Hey, you stole paper clips in the office. Didn't you lie? Didn't you look on the computer? Something you shouldn't have. Oh, no. You're trying to create a need they don't have. Yeah. Others, it's their need is for purpose. They feel empty. They feel what's the point of all this? Well, they're Jesus' kingdom is a beautiful aspect of the gospel, of saying it's a whole new purpose, a whole new way to live. For others, it's love, the lack of relationships, and so they're the gospel of adoption, you are a son and daughter brought into a physical family, that you have new life, new relationships. And then for others, it's the brokenness of being burnt out on religion. And it's hey, no, good news is Jesus has replaced the temple, the sacrifices, the priests, everything. You don't need any of this. eventually they get the whole picture of who Jesus is, but what door they enter is based on where they're at. So I think when we think about, and I think part of the problem is we've so shrunk the gospel to this very transactional, like Dallas Willard talked about, this sort of sin removing kind of thing, that then it's the only way we know how to talk about it. And we think it's the only, whereas like Jesus talked about it in a way that was so holistic, the kingdom kind of being like the biggest part of that, recognizing, okay, where are people at? What is the need in this culture in this time? How do we help people see that Jesus is the answer to that? He's the answer to every need, but like, what's this one this time?
What are some of the ways you've created that type of culture within the Well? Thinking now about the archetype, and then, okay, there's going to be multiple doors that potential archetype could enter into. Okay, now you have, the fun, the clay of how do we actually create the sort of community here that considers these things. So can you share with us a little bit how you've done that as part of the Well?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, so we have a pastor of spiritual formation who's on our staff, and he started probably 12 years ago. And, we started having some really significant conversations like, really, how are people formed, right? Because I think that I know why we use these terms, but it's a false dichotomy to talk about evangelism and discipleship, because these aren't two different things. It's like, what does following Jesus look like in terms of a whole journey, right? So we started asking ourselves, okay, well, what role does the Sunday message play in that? What role does the Sunday service play in that? What role do spiritual practices play in that? What role does relational connection in the community play in that? What role does the out of Sunday stuff or people's understanding of their own calling in their workplace and their schools? I think when we start asking all those questions, it actually helps us to know, in one sense, like the Sunday sermon's not discipling anyone, really. Like, what role is it? What role does it play? What role does even Sunday play? I think it pulls us away from this, having this Sunday-centric and even sermon-centric view of teaching and formation, to go, no, it plays one part, but really most of the hours people are going to spend are outside anyways. Yeah. So I think just starting to talk about what role do each of the various touch points in community life play in what the gospel is and how are people formed in it was the beginning point of that. I can give you more specifics, but that's kind of where we started.
Yeah. Well, why don't you get a little bit more specific for him? So, I'm imagining, 31-year-old, tech entrepreneur, his partner has just gotten pregnant. It's kind of going, he's having one of these existential moments where he breaks out of the imminent frame, something we've talked about on this podcast before. You are his colleague at work. How are you helping your church member who has that colleague come alongside and have a culture of invitation, and where would they begin?
So good. So I think one of the things we said was that, man, every Sunday has to be consistently invitable. Your people have to know that when they bring some, because, if they're like, I'm not sure it's going to be a good Sunday. We've all had that experience where our friend finally came. We're like, oh my gosh, it's one of these Sundays. So you're just like, you can't do that. You can't do that because you don't know when someone's going to say yes. It may not be the day you invite them. Some people, it's like 2 years later and they're like, hey, don't you go to that church or whatever? And it's like, I think I want to come. So our people have to feel like, oh yeah, like I can, and I don't mean that inviting to church is the only way to do that, but for sure they have to feel like that. So we're always asking every year in our survey, like, did you invite someone to church in the last year? Like how we watch that percentage, like how, and that isn't just about, people don't want to do this. Like, no, like they want to know, like if they bring their friend or their spouse or whatever, they're cashing chips, like you have to deliver. And it's not about like, it has to be amazing. It just can't, like, it has to be consistent. It has to be authentic. It has to be relatable. It has to be. So I think that we've talked about like, what is the language? What is the liturgy? What is the thing that is always accessible? And then people say, oh, you're a secret church. I'm like, well, okay. Like every church is a secret church, aren't they? Like there's that's a false dichotomy. Our thing is you can be relevant to everyone in the room. Wherever people are, and we use that language, wherever you are, right? Because someone just needs to know I can find myself. Now, when you say wherever you are in your spiritual journey, that's not offensive to somebody who's a committed follower of Jesus. But if you say, well, we all believe this, don't we? And it's like someone sitting there going, I don't believe that yet. Well, that is kind of at least exclusion. It may not be offensive, right? So like you say things to, again, the target that the next circle out is going to relate to, but it has to work for this group. So the language of how we do it. So we want our people to feel like they can invite somebody in, but also our social media strategy primarily is not to reach people who don't even know us. It's to give our people stuff that they can forward easily to their friends. So we do, most of our series are needs-based in terms of where people are at, whether it's on money, on healthy relationships, on whatever. And that people feel like, oh my gosh, they'll say, Vijay, I forwarded this, like, or I've invited someone, like we say, hey, this is coming, like, invite somebody or send them the content, even if they're ministering, if they never come to our church, you're kind of you're an ambassador, you're an emissary, you've got one hand on them and one hand on God, and you're standing in between that, So, so I think those are some of the ways that we've done that. And then, we see some of our live on mission is one of our faith catalysts. And a lot of the stuff we do actually is very, people who don't go to church actually are looking for ways to make a difference in the world. So involvement in justice, and alleviation of poverty and, fighting human trafficking, stuff like that, some of the stuff that we've been involved in. We just say people in your life are actually, they want to know about that. Like they expect the church to be involved in that stuff. I've had friends that come to me say, Vijay, I want to get back. I want to have some time or have some extra money. What can I do with this? The church helps people know how to connect with a heart for our God. And they start to associate the church with like, oh yeah, that church does those things. Right. So we said, these are highly invitable events that we try to do, like not on a Sunday morning or whatever. Like our kids do a market every year where they get a microloan for $10 and they create a business or whatever. And then that money they raise goes to a kids in crisis center we're part of in Africa, but also some of our local partners who are all involved in kind of helping marginalized women. And people invite their friends to this market. It's like, and like people with other kids, like their minds are like, oh my gosh, I want my kids to have this kind of vision in their life. And the kids just up the creativity every year. So we said, hey, those are natural opportunities for people to connect, and it helps them understand the good news is really good news, right? For the world. So stuff like that, I think has been helpful to shape what we do and why we do it and where we do it.
Could you break down a little bit this church survey? I think that's obviously something that you do. I think it's amazing just imagining things about what this helps you do. But could you share with us what that church survey is, some of the other things that you ask on it?
Mm-hmm. So we do two actually. And one is one we started a long time ago. We do it every other year, roughly. It's called the NCD survey. It's Natural Church Development. And there's all kinds of different tools you can use. We like it because it measures 8 quality characteristics of health in your church. Like, it does just, do people go to small groups, but are the small groups holistic? Not just do you do evangelism, but is it need-based? Not just do you have a worship service, but is it inspiring? So there's 8 quality characteristics that you measure with people who are serving in a home group, like vested people who, because if they're like, hey, well, I don't really feel connected, but they're not in a group. It's like, well, but if they're in a group, is that group connecting them? Do they feel like people are praying for them? So that's like a set standard survey. We do it every 2 years. We have 9 surveys now. So any one survey is a snapshot, but for me, the delta, the trajectory, what's moving and changing over those. So that's been super helpful, which tends to be more like with the board and the staff we use. But then every year we do just an annual congregational survey of who's in the room on a Sunday. And we just take 5 minutes during the service and we say, hey, would you fill this out? We have it online or whatever, or like people scan. And that's like, where did you come from? Like, what's your faith background? Were you at a church before you came to the well? How would you describe sort of like the faith you grew up in? How would you describe where your faith was at before you came to this church? And there's a list of things. Where is it now? What's helped you move? What spiritual practices are you engaging in or not? Which things would you feel like you'd like to take more steps in? So we try to keep it not like, there's obviously all kinds of questions you want to ask. We try to keep it enough, judicious enough, and then just measure that every year. And just that helps us know like what percentage of people in the room are from a faith background or not. Are they seeing movement in their lives spiritually as a result of this? What spiritual practices seem very natural for them to engage in? What things do they want to grow more in? Because I just want to know who's in the room, and It's a bit of a blunt instrument. It doesn't tell you everything, but it goes along with, sometimes we're just only informed by the anecdotal conversation. Well, I talked to somebody on Sundays, this and this. It's like, okay, good. But the anecdotal information is good, but like, where's the statistical stuff? And where's the movement happening year over year? I feel like with these things, if you're going to do it, you got to do it consistently, because you can't tell what's changing otherwise, right?
I think it's so insightful because you're trying to get a real pulse on where people are at. And I think probably far too many leaders have a perspective of like, well, they're just not very mature in their relationship with Jesus. So, but they still need to try to just get along with get with the program. Come on, people.
Yeah.
And they don't make adjustments based upon where their people are actually. Could you share with us maybe a story of maybe you determined it as success or fruitfulness from doing that survey and how it's assisted you year by year in the life of the well?
Mm-hmm. I mean, one that immediately comes to mind was around like scripture reading, right? So like, it's easy to go exactly like you said, Matt. Oh, what's wrong with people? People don't read their Bible. People are biblically illiterate. They're just addicted to digital content. Therefore, this. It's like, well, and I remember this guy from Franklin Covey years ago saying, he was a speaker. He said, if one or two people in your community or your organization are doing something, it's probably their thing, their problem. If whole chunks of people are not doing something, you have to ask yourself, wait a second, what do we need to do differently? Right. Mm-hmm. And so we were writing these blogs every week and like sending them out. Like our pastoral staff was, like kind of helping, like tied to the series, and people reading. We're like, man, like, is anybody reading? It's a joke. Or like, our own spouses aren't even reading this stuff. Like, what are we doing? Mm-hmm. And then we're reading in the survey, like, okay, scripture is one of these like black boxes for people, right? They're just like, I want to know. I don't do it very often, but I would like to grow in that consistently. So I'm like, okay, they want to grow in it.
Yeah.
How do we do this, right? So then this is when we flipped to YouVersion, and it was like, hey, what if we just do Bible reading plans that are app-based? YouVersion's got this amazing app. Why are we trying to reinvent the wheel? And why are we blogging for like, it was taking so much energy out of us, and we weren't even sure people are reading. It's like, let's just read the Bible together. Let's get people to sign up by site, because we have 3 sites. So they're just on the reading plan. And then we have a rotation of our team that just posts for the day. And it's not like a whole blog. It's just like, we're reading with them, and we're just, for the week I'm on tap to write, 5 sentences on what stuck out to me in the scripture for that day, because there's a little comment section at the end of the reading plan. And we just do it. And like, first of all, we're able to track it more compared to our blog, because you can just see who's on. It gives us the reading plans reset every like 8 weeks. So it gives you a chance to like advertise it again on the Sunday and get new people in. And then some people comment and post or like or whatever. And so it was just like kind of realizing we just need to change how we're doing this. And how do we invite, and how do we tie that into what we're doing on Sundays? Because that was one of the other things, was like, if we're expecting people to like study the Bible separately from what they're talking about in home groups, separately from what they're doing on a Sunday, like nobody can keep track of it. They can't possibly apply all of that in a given week. So we make sure that our home groups are locked into what our Sunday services are doing. And anyone who's writing on the blog or the Bible reading for that day, even if it's not exactly, just tied into the series we're in, help people see the sense of integration of God at work in their lives. Because that's one of the things I think they struggle with the most, is like, where's God in my everyday life? Mm-hmm. So that's just one example. Another one, I guess I would say, was for a while there, we would see, I would say like 15 to 20, 25% of the people coming to the church had not been a part of any church beforehand. But post-COVID, that number went down a lot in terms of a larger percentage of newer people coming from churches, other churches, which for a while we were kind of like allergic to that. Like when we first started the church, we're like, we do not want like, don't leave your church for us. Like, we're not better. We're just different, But I thought, but when we saw this post-COVID, we're like, no, this makes sense actually. Because a lot of people have gotten disconnected from a church during COVID. Some of their churches have closed during COVID. Some of them said, oh, your church was the only one our teenagers would watch. So I'm like, okay, so you're moving for your youth to stay connected in the church. I'm like, those are pretty good reasons. Like, so it was just kind of seeing the trends change and like, why is that changing? And just kind of, then you could bring in some of the anecdotes and go, I think we're piecing together what's going on. So that sort of the quantitative data gives you a little bit of, helps make sense of some of the qualitative data.
Just as we close, Vijay, I'm wondering if you could speak to, as you're, serving your congregation, as you're engaged with others that are in leadership in the Canadian church, as you're hearing, from those that are within your community in different spheres of influence, where are you seeing opportunities for the sowing of the gospel? And maybe it's in places that some of the listeners wouldn't expect.
Yeah, I think it was my friend Dom Russo, who's a church planter in Montreal, the 180. He said we were told and expected, and some of this is from Charles Taylor as well, but we expected that secularism was going to be unspiritual, atheistic. It's not. It's highly spiritual. Like I was saying, psychedelics, goddess cards, and in many ways, this was Charles Taylor's assessment. The church has sort of been disenchanted, and we're late to the party. The world is highly spiritual. And so I think just this more simple approaches to effective evangelism in this culture is dismantling of atheism through apologetics. It's for the most part, I don't see that as the primary obstacles. People are looking for spiritual encounter. And I think in a world that is highly spiritual, to see that the Spirit of God is more powerful. So for me, that's praying with people as often as you can. We try to tell our people, don't just say you'll pray for someone, pray with them right there on the bus, at work. When they hear you talking to a God personally, that it's not even the content of your prayer. It's just that you're talking to a God that that sometimes was a friend of mine, I remember I went to business school with, whatever. And, she'd come over to our house and then I just prayed with her after, and about something. And she turns to me, she goes, holy blank. She's like, you do that for your kids every night? This was a spiritual experience. So I think how do we bring the power of the Holy Spirit to highly spiritual people through prayer and whatever? And yes, it's messy because they bring in their new age stuff and becomes a mashup, but that's okay. God can read the book of Acts. The Spirit's good at sorting out all of that stuff. But I just think spiritual encounter, and even in our Sunday services, we do on Sunday, we did some prophetic words where I didn't use that terminology, but I said, hey, I've asked some people to listen to God on your behalf and to speak out some words. And so if this is for you, this may be the first time you've ever felt oh my gosh, God is speaking to me. So having spiritual experiences in the service. So rather than, my wife was big on this. She said, Vijay, don't speak for 35 minutes on prayer. Speak for 20 minutes and then take time in the middle of the sermon to pray. Teach us how to do this. This is a lab. So turning our services into labs, spiritual labs, has been really rewarding for our own people who are longtime followers of Jesus, right? But for new people, it's oh my gosh, it's a spiritual encounter. That's what they're coming to church for, right? Not to hear a good talk. They want to know, is God real? So yeah, I would say that that's one of the biggest things. That's outside the church and inside.
Well, friends, I'm sure you would agree that there is so much from my conversation with Vijay that could be applied as this episode's action step. The thing that I want to focus on, however, is kind of a combination of two of the points he made. One is the door that people enter into as far as hearing the gospel, and the other is that we live in a very spiritual society. And to the spiritual point, I would simply encourage you, as Vijay did, to be spiritual. Be people of prayer. Pray for somebody right on the spot. What they're going to recognize and notice is that you are somebody who seems to know God. If you're praying as you regularly pray with somebody else, they're going to notice a distinct difference with the way you pray than maybe what they think you pray or maybe the formal thing that they see on television. The other thing that Vijay talked about was the door that people enter into when they come to hear the good news. For some people, it is substitutionary atonement, the fact that Christ died for our sins. But for the others, it's for themes of purpose or meaning or identity or the reality that they come to be part of a family. And what you and I are invited to do is to discern certain individuals that we live in relationship with and which is actually good news for the people that we are living in relationship with, and invite them towards that. And then again, be spiritual, and trust that as you are walking in relationship with the Holy Spirit, that will itself be attractive to other people and you'll have the opportunity to influence them. Well, as always, thanks for taking a listen to this episode. I'd invite you to go ahead and share it with someone that you believe this would be a benefit to. And now I'm going to leave you with a clip from my conversation next week with Joanna LaFleur, who is going to be sharing with us all about digital media and storytelling.
I hope what people are hearing is that we don't need to, I think sometimes we aren't sharing stories in digital places because we overthink it, we overcomplicate it. It can be more simple and more impactful than we realize. I hope some of the very practical things I shared would inspire people to say, okay, I could do that. I can write an email this week and ask people 3 questions and ask them for a photo. Everyone can do that. So I hope people hear that it can be done. And I hope also people hear that we have a responsibility to steward and tell stories, to tell the stories of God's work, declare his work one generation to the next, tell of his mighty deeds, that there is good news to share. And there is lots of doom and gloom in the world, doom and gloom in the church, that people love to focus on bad news. We all know that the algorithm loves to feed us more bad news because we react to it. But there is a lot of good news to share and to hear. And I think we need to encourage one another, to spur one another on through these encouraging stories.